inspection and testing company in the world, and SGS India itself has 4,500 people operating from over 50 locations and covering a wide range of industries, including consumer products, pharmaceuticals, minerals, oil and gas, environment, industrial, and food and automotive. Paul is a very experienced expatriate, having lived and worked all over the world in a number of very, very challenging environments, including South Africa, Zambia, Mongolia, the Middle East, North America, and Australia. So Paul's been a director of SGS in India for 12 years now, and has lived in Delhi as managing director for the last 7 years. So I'm really delighted to have Paul with us to share his experiences. We're joined by Kapil Dua, who's the CFO and Director of Financial Consulting at Sannam and spends a lot of his time advising individuals and companies on taxation and immigration matters. And myself, I'm Ed Dixon. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Sannam and I've lived and worked in India since 1997, living over the last 3 years, but working since 1997. So I should just explain briefly what we're going to do. So we're going to cover 3 broad areas on the webinar. The first is working in India and getting some perspectives on that as an expatriate. The second is living in India and getting some perspectives on that. And then the third is a look at the sort of taxation and immigration side of things. Just in terms of logistics, you've got the ability to submit questions as we go through, and I will try and farm those questions out as we receive them. So I think just one health warning before we get going on a topic like expatriates. Expatriate covers, individuals from lots of different nations, of lots of different origins and so on. So inevitably one is drawn into some stereotypes. So if we use a stereotype that you feel uncomfortable about, we apologize in advance. But what we're trying to do is use some real life practical examples to help the thought process of people that are looking at coming to India, whether that's a company or an individual. So what I'm going to do now is turn over to Paul. Paul's on the phone this evening in Mumbai, and Paul will take us through, I guess, his perspectives on life working in India. You'll see some slides that will have a couple of bullets, so I'll turn it over to Paul. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ed, and good evening to everybody who's joining this Sannam S4 webinar. As Ed graciously outlined, I personally spent quite some time in India and abroad in general, and obviously it's easy to find a lot of differences and similarities both in working as an expat when comparing India to other places. I guess the most common question that I get working here is whether or not as an expat we see India being the great opportunity that everybody hopes it will be. And certainly an organisation that chooses to come and invest in India obviously has some expectations in terms of its return on investment and economic outlook. In the present day, we are seeing quite a substantial amount of change, and everybody would obviously be aware of the recent change in government. The initial momentum that's been created through that change seems to be quite strong. Within our organisation, we are optimistic about the outlook. We are positive about some of the changes we are seeing. And we are generally, across all of our different business units, relatively positive about the language that we are hearing from the various government departments and some of the policy changes that are happening and how that's manifesting itself in trade and foreign direct investment and some of the programs that are being talked about and policy changes. I would outline that what we do see as a pretty critical stop in all of those initiatives that are being announced is the availability of power. and I think that the government acknowledges and is pretty keen to resolve the power supply issue. Are pretty much dependent on being able to resolve the dispute with power, and that falls into two categories. Both the supply of fuel to generate the power and also resolving some tariffing issues that will allow new plants or existing plants under construction that have been mothballed to be restarted, and also new plants to be developed. And if that comes to fruition, then I think the government has a very, very strong chance of delivering its other promises and achieving its objectives, and that should be good across a wide number of sectors. I think a common statement that we use to describe India is that describing India as a single country is a little like describing Africa as a single country. And I think it's important that if you are defining a strategy for this country, then you should break it up a little bit into its component parts. Certainly there are articles available from McKinsey and the like that talk about natural demographic groups and sub-regions that don't necessarily follow state boundary lines, but are very valuable in understanding how different aspects of the country work together or don't work together, as the case may be. Everyone tends to be very attracted to the fact that there is 1.2 billion people, and there is everyone likes to think that that opportunity is available with a single strategy. In reality, there are Uttar Pradesh, for example, as a single state, is the size of Brazil. You have a very, very different culture in West Bengal than you do from Tamil Nadu. Equally, in the north part of the country operates differently than in the west region around Maharashtra and Mumbai. And as such, there needs to be, I think, some consideration for how you approach each of those markets and the way you will interact with suppliers, customers, and even employees in each of those areas. The real talent in India is very deep. There is an extraordinarily strong education base, and you can access some a very competent workforce. Very obviously, English being a dominant language and the language of business means that you get access to some extremely articulate and well-educated resources. We do find often that there is a strong challenge in finding the right resources. In one sense, there is an enormous amount of education, but their exposure to the rest of the world may be limited. And so sometimes when recruiting and finding resources, if you need to recruit resources that have a global outlook, certainly they exist in abundance in India, but you may have to work a little harder to find them. And one of a strong piece of advice we would give is that you take a little bit of extra time when searching for the right candidate, and in particular searching for managerial candidates. It's very important that when you find, when you're looking to put in place a senior management team, that you take the extra time and that you indoctrinate, or rather induct them into your organization very carefully and involve your global head office and your global operations into that process, so that they become genuinely connected with your organization. From the day-to-day perspective, there is a significant, there is obviously a very, very strong local culture, and again, that culture varies widely from one end of the country to the other. However, there are some things that are relatively common, and that is that there is a very strong respect for the chain of command, and when working around or with that chain of command, your management style in working needs to accommodate that. Historically, a lot of domestic companies in India have a very strong and dominant promoter who heads the company, and you will find that that person tends to control a lot of the decisions. As such, when you're working with a team in India, there is often a tendency for your managers to come to you to seek decisions to be made. for them. That's okay. We refer to that as delegating up in some sense, and it takes quite a bit of practiced effort to encourage your management team to come to you with solutions rather than just questions, and encourage them to make those decisions with some suitable guidelines and safety nets. Job descriptions tend to be very literal, and an individual is very comfortable working within their written area of responsibility, but they may not be comfortable taking wider leadership or wider management decisions if they don't have specific authority, and that's often explains sometimes why you are expecting a particular project or a particular decision to be advanced, but if the person that's working in your team feels that that is beyond their specific mandate, there may be a challenge in them making that decision without coming to you first and seeking your approval or indeed your direct decision or instruction. So empowering your team to be confident in taking decisions will take time, and it does involve, like a lot of things, nearly everything here is an extraordinary amount of trust, which really leads me on to the point about the relationship culture. India has a very strong relationship culture, and in every aspect, from sales to customer care, it is very important that the emotional connection that you make with your employees or your customers or your suppliers builds on a continually growing foundation of strong relationships. It is very difficult to manage sales on a fly-in and fly-out basis. Your presence on the ground, your commitment to India as a country, your commitment by spending time with your staff or with your clients or with your suppliers continues to add to and build up that relationship and that trust. And over a period of time, you will find that that will then start to manifest itself in stronger business, working relationships, employee relationships, and so on. And whether it's taking the time out to, and as a result, the perception for Western businesses coming in is often that things do not move as quickly as you would expect or as you may be used to, and as such, and usually it's attributable to being able to take that time and build those relationships. There is a strong tendency, for example, to have meals together, lunches and dinners, taking the time to visit and have tea or share a drink is also an important part of building that relationship. In terms of time management, India shares a characteristic that is common with many parts of the world, and that is that time can be quite relative. It is very common for meetings to be quite impromptu and quite late at night, or if you were working with the government or other bureaucracy, they are genuinely very busy, and they genuinely have a lot of appointments to work through. And as such, you may be called in very short notice to a meeting. You may be called quite late at night to a meeting, and you may be asked to wait for quite a significant amount of time before you get your audience with whomever it is you are planning to meet. The good news out of that is that it does happen. You will get that meeting, and it will, in spite of the time that you take. And again, that time spent is an investment in building the relationship. And so, whereas some Western cultures will find that frustrating, it's actually an important and valuable growing experience in building your business here. There can be a lot of frustrations with communication, as is often the case in South Asia and Asia. There is a strong tendency to avoid strong words like the word no, and understanding when somebody agrees or says yes to your question. It takes some time to work out whether the answer is yes, I understand what you're saying, or yes, I agree with you, which are two very different things. When working here in managing your communication, it's very important that you engage in a lot of open questions and actively encourage team members to contribute to a discussion, and it's a very concerted, it's got to be a practice that you build into your day-to-day working habits. Equally, when you're concluding a meeting, it's the strongest or the most positive experience I find is if you go through a process of validation at the end of any meeting when you've agreed actions or outcomes. Going through a process of revalidation and covering again each of the points you think you've agreed is an important part in ensuring that either everybody is on the same page and understands the same outcome, or that if somebody doesn't agree with you, that validation process or revalidation process is an opportunity to identify that, and it'll come back to you in how that validation is confirmed to you or not. In working with customers and suppliers, that is where it's very beneficial to have your team advising you and ensuring that whilst you may be wanting to make decisions and move quickly, often you need to trust your team very closely to advise you as to whether or not an opportunity is genuinely going to progress at the pace you feel, or that the people you are engaging with genuinely agree with you and are as committed as you believe they are. In the regulatory environment here can be very complicated. There are many practices here that from a human resources perspective would be frowned upon or even illegal in other countries. As an example, when you're engaging employees in an employment interview, it's quite common here to find people asking questions about their marriage intentions, their date of birth, which leads to their age, whether they have many dependents in their family, whether they're planning to have a family, which in many Western countries is very heavily frowned upon or even illegal, as I said, whereas it is relatively common practice here for those conversations to be had. And so adapting your organization locally and training your HR teams to ensure that you are compliant with the standards that you expect is an important part of building your business. A very important thing to understand is that the relationship culture that you have at work obviously stems from a strong relationship culture that your teams will have at home. And as such, when you're looking to build your workforce here, the decision is usually not only taken by the person you are interviewing, but that candidate will be having a discussion with their family, their partner, their father, their wider family group. And those decisions are often group decisions, and understanding that is an important part of understanding how quickly a candidate will come back to you with confirmation, or the questions that they will ask you in seeking to clarify their role, accepting changes in their role or changes in their designation. It is quite common that you will believe that you've engaged in a contract, and we quite often refer to the World Bank survey called the Ease of Doing Business, which is a readily available website for everybody. The Ease of Doing Business survey, I think, is updated every year or every second year, and it ranks about 184 countries on the ease of doing business in across a number of metrics. So whether it's opening a bank account, paying taxes, engaging in litigation, hiring employees, terminating employees, and so on. And India, along with every other country that you may be invested in already or planning to invest in, is ranked through this survey. One of the often frustrating points is that on one particular metrics, which is the enforceability of contracts, India is ranked quite lowly relative to nearly every other country. What that means is when you believe that you've signed a contract or reached an agreement, the relationship does not end there. And whilst it may be different than the way you operate in a Western country, it is not the way it operates in India, and it's not wrong, it's not bad, it's just different. And taking the time to understand that and be cognizant of that and the need to constantly manage that relationship even after an agreement has been signed is critical to the success of any endeavour that you're looking to invest in. And failing to do that is often what leads to a lot of frustration on the part of investors and organisations coming in. And as such, there is often a lot of unexpected, what most people will consider to be unexpected surprises, whether it's a change in government policy, whether it's a change in a partner's decision or a customer's decision. It's something that needs to be constantly managed, which, as I alluded to before, is done through constant and close management of relationships. Having worked in a number of other countries around the world, emerging market environments are delightfully challenging. And if you have experience in those environments and you compared it to coming and working in India, the difference is a little bit like being a grandmaster in checkers and then being asked to engage in a game of chess. It is simply infinitely more complex and nuanced and in my view, beautifully so. And if you take the time to understand it, it is very rewarding. And you will find that that your experience here will be much more successful, both personally and professionally. The final topic, I think, on the slide that you can see covers bribery and corruption. With the change of the Modi of the government and the incoming Modi government, there is he has a strong reputation in being anti-corruption and ensuring that his administration allows business to operate functionally without impediments like bribery. Of course, it still exists in many aspects of business and of government. And one thing to be cognizant of is that as a foreign company investing in India, your code of integrity and your policies governing bribery will obviously be very strong as they are required under the UK laws or the US laws. However, when enforcing that within your own team, it is important to understand that your team members in their day-to-day lives are also facing that in their own households, whether it's buying a house, having their power turned on, getting their taxes paid, getting their car registered. And so the standard that you set for your organisation, whilst you are doing the right thing, and you should, and you can get business done by being patient, it is also important to acknowledge that your staff are maybe having to operate one way at home and yet another way inside the organisation. And acknowledging that is an important part of getting your team to commit to your policy on bribery and corruption.
That's great.
I think that covers the major points I wanted to discuss. And Ed, I'll pass back to you if there are any questions that you would like.
Yeah, I mean, so we've had one question in which was just a fairly general question, but if you've been in the country 7 years, your experience with India extends past that. If you were coming in to the country now, what things would you do differently than you did when you arrived?
Yes, I think I would definitely spend a lot more time at the front end in my communication and relationship building. Particularly in the team alignment side of your own team, and spending time getting to know your customers and suppliers and key relationships in the market. It sounds obvious, and I'm sure most people believe that they will do it or do it. However, as I said before, if I compare India to other environments, with the benefit of hindsight, I would have spent much more time on that up front. And I would have done it much earlier and with a much deeper commitment to understanding how to build those relationships at every level in your organisation.
Useful. Okay. Well, look, thanks, Paul. We'll come back to some other questions in due course. And I guess one of the reasons why it's tough to focus on some of those items that you were just identifying when you first arrived is that you've got to get your own life set up. So I'm just going to take us through the living in India section. Now, the reality is this varies substantially from one individual and one company to the next. On the one hand, very large corporates with strong infrastructure behind them that are used to moving expatriates around the world may be set up to make this a bit easier. At the other end of the spectrum, there are just as many, I would think, expatriates arriving in India, either trying to set up a business on their own or pursue something without that infrastructure. So I'm just going to run through a few areas, and I'm going to focus deliberately on, I guess, the challenges to start with, and then I'll come on to, I guess, what I've called the upside. But there are certainly challenges, and I'm going to talk through them candidly. So the first issue, obviously, not everyone is married or has a partner, but a key part to any executive, male or female, in getting themselves effective in the workplace is to make sure that on the home front all is well. And there's this, I still think, terrible expression, trailing spouse, but making sure that your trailing spouse is comfortable is very, very important to the dynamic home and in the workplace. Now, India, we'll come on to talk a bit about immigration later, but India has some unique challenges there which don't make it easy for a trailing spouse to work. Obviously, if that's not possible, then it's important to make sure that the individual that is not finding themselves stuck in a new country, unsupported, and without things to keep them busy and fulfilled. So certainly an area where a lot of effort is required. I'd argue perhaps the most important thing on this list. The second point I've put down is day-to-day frustrations. So particularly if you're coming from an environment that's highly organized, if I personalize that to myself, I moved to India from Chicago in the US, where life was easy, and then you arrive in India to a whole series of processes, behaviors which are alien, and that's, I've worked in and out of India since 1997. Getting your phone line set up, sorting out a car, getting the bank account set up, tax numbers. It's a stressful process. You'll be asked for your mother's and father's names, dates of birth, more photos than you can imagine that have to be signed in a particular way. This is not a way of living that certainly I was used to. And that can cause frustrations, and many people do find that very frustrating. And the reality is there's no shortcut through that, really. My advice is to make sure that people are aware that's going to happen, and you really have to accept it. It's how India works, and it's part of living here. So the next one is schooling, and obviously this varies substantially from location to location. But the structure of the school fees and that sort of thing can be a bit daunting, in as much as many schools ask for what's called a development fee or a capital sum that you pay up front. And in some cases you're making that commitment without actually a guaranteed place, because there'll be a condition that the school needs to meet and interview your children. That's a bit uncomfortable when you're sat the other side of the world. But, and then in terms of schooling, you then obviously need to choose the type of school. There are great Indian schools, not necessarily that easy to get your kids into. Typically, you're assessed on a points-based system, and it's a very competitive education market domestically. There are then international schools of various different types, and aligned to particular nationalities and so on. Some true diplomatic schools, others are Indian schools that happen to focus on a particular curriculum. So understanding that landscape, working out what you can afford, the quality of the education that your kids are going to get, and securing a place is also, I think, high up the list. And and being candid, there are instances of families coming with 3 or 4 children, and 3 get into school. One needs some homeschooling for a period of time until they can secure a place. and you need to know that up front, because that's going to be a disruptive event. Safety. So safety, I mean, that covers a lot of ground. On the one hand, health and safety, and I know some nationalities find India, more concerning than others in that respect. But it's quite normal to have electrical sockets that perhaps aren't quite to the standard you'd expect, holes in the road, whatever it happens to be. It's life in India. You can do a certain amount to obviously make sure that your home is as you would want it to be, but there's a certain amount of acceptance there. And then personal safety is the other side, and India has a bit of a recent, not track record, but there have been a number of major rape cases that have been reported internationally, and personal security is a consideration. My own view on it is with following some sensible principles, which pretty much fall into the kind of common sense category, that you can mitigate that risk, but you've got to accept that in some areas the country is going to be a less secure place than you're used to. Visas, we'll talk a bit more about visas, but the one big hassle with visas is that you need to go through a visa process every year. That's linked to your bank account, so if you don't get your visa renewed, your bank account typically gets cut off, which is emotive, and there is a two-stage visa process as well, which Kapil will talk us through. Health, and that's a topic that ranges from concerns on Delhi belly all the way through to what happens if I need some more significant surgical intervention, or whatever it happens to be. The reality is India, I think India's biggest form of tourism is health tourism. Again, depending on where you are in the country, there's access to good healthcare, and you can buy private medical insurance or the equivalent, or included as part of your package. That means that you've got access to that. So on Delhi belly, again, there are principles, rules that you can follow that minimize that. There's a little bit of rite of passage there, but life can exist very happily. I've said here kids attract a lot of attention. I mean, the reality is when we first arrived as a family, you expect to get, or you don't expect, but you do get photographed a lot and things like that, which is not something that you're used to, but your kids in particular will apply to. That's a new feeling for them. You work out how you're going to cope with that. So the bottom point on the challenges is just, it's a roller coaster. On the days where India is great, you wouldn't want to be anywhere else in the world. It really is a phenomenal country. And on the bad days, it's bad. The part of the journey of arriving in India is accepting that you're going to get ups and downs, and when you're on the down, you know that you will come back up again. And that's easy for me to say, and it's difficult to actually live that. But there is a community there of people to support you, and I think at least being aware of this stuff is half the battle. So on the upside, I've said when the days are good, they're amazing. India has a hugely rich history, culture, and that's in people, in food, in religion, diversity, architecture, you name it. And it's a huge privilege to experience that, and I certainly enjoy that. The second thing is that change is tangible. So Paul referenced Prime Minister Modi, and particularly at the moment there's a buzz about India, and also, I mean, in the very short time that I've been in India, you see change in front of you, whether it can be very cosmetic, it could be more fundamental, whether it's new metro projects, new restaurants, etc., etc. You really do see the country changing in front of you. From an expatriate perspective, obviously India provides tremendous travel opportunities, both within India, within the surrounding region. Most expatriates I know take full advantage of that. India has a a great, albeit about to be modernised, railway system. There are lots of domestic airlines that allow you to fly around the country relatively cheaply, so it's something you have to take advantage of. There's a small but very supportive expatriate community. Not everyone wants to plug into that, I understand that, but for those that do, everybody's been through the same journey, so there's always people there to support, lend advice, sell you bits of kit, whatever it happens to be. Help at home, certainly for me, that was a new concept, and that it certainly adds lots of benefits to one's daily life. It also introduces a whole new set of challenges in terms of how one manages that. It's enough to manage your life at work, but then you have a team at home as well. But overall, it's of a great benefit. And then in terms of home comforts, I think particularly over the last 5 years, Indian food I'm a great fan of, but every now and then some home comforts are appreciated. Increasingly there are stores that will sell imported goods, so as and when you get that need, it's available. And I think finally it's just a massively unique experience, and Paul better to talk on this later, given the number of countries he's lived and worked in. But for me, I absolutely love both the work and living side of India, despite the individual challenges. And I'll just make one point. Obviously, every location in India has its own pluses and minuses. I think one that's certainly the sort of Delhi-based expatriates are concerned about is air quality. For anyone that follows air quality reporting, Delhi is amongst the worst air quality in kind of major cities around the world, and at times even worse than Beijing, which gets a lot of press. So again, you're better knowing that. There are things you can do to mitigate it in terms of buying air purifiers and that sort of thing, and I know a lot of people do that for their kids. But it's a great opportunity to get out of Delhi occasionally, and that does change through the year based on the climate and so on. So I think that's probably enough on living in Delhi, and we'll perhaps come back to some questions shortly on that. So why don't we move over to tax and regulatory, because obviously to actually get into the country there are a few requirements. So Kapil, do you want to take us through those areas?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Ed. And let me try to cover the basic issue which tax and regulatory perspective an expat has to think about it. And I'll try to cover in a way that what an expat has to think and what a company, like a foreign company investing into India and sending their expats into India, what they need to think about it from a broader perspective. So first and foremost, expat coming into India, he need to look out for his current situation in the home country. So what kind of taxation, national insurance, for example, if you're coming from UK, what kind of national insurance you are right now into? Do you want to get out of national insurance? Because you need to think about when you go back, and would you be allowed to get into the same package which you were working on? So particularly you need to watch out where you are right now in your home country from a tax perspective. From if you're coming again from UK, you need to watch out your taxation with HMRC. How many days you will be in India, and when you go back for example, back to UK as a home country, then would you be taxable in that same year or not? So from that perspective, the best advice I would say is to requirement in the home country. Then the most important is specifically to look out visas. So India, if I say from a regulatory perspective, we have 10 kinds of visas in India, but for an expat who would like to work in India or want to come to India on a work visa, then the basic most appropriate visa is the employment visa. And there are other 9 categories like tourist visa, business visa, entry visa, dependent visa, research visa. But the most appropriate if you want to work in India is the employment visa. And once you get the employment visa, there is one more very peculiar requirement that when you land in India after getting an employment visa, you have to register yourself within 15 days of landing in India with the Foreign Regional Registration Office. and that is very important because if that registration with the foreign regional office will become your address proof, will become your proof that you have actually landed in India, you are trying to work in India, and these are the address where you're gonna work, and that FRR registration will work as a proof of address going forward for your bank account, for your tax registration. So it's you cannot ignore that. That's a very good thing which you need to work at. Another very good point is about the employment options. So when I'm as an expat coming to India, thinking about that I want to go and work in India, so should I remain on an employment of a home country? Do I need to come back to a subsidiary of my parent company who's in India, operating in India as a subsidiary company? Can I shift my employment to the subsidiary country or company or not? So typically speaking, there are only two options: the employment shift to the Indian company, or employment remains with the foreign company and you are seconded or assigned to the Indian entity. You may have an option that even though you are working in India under the Indian employment, your salaries could be paid to you in the home country. So you do have that option. So again, from a tax perspective, your employer and you personally have to vouch each and every option, which is best in that current scenario to you and your employer. The other things which is very important is about tax registration. When you land in India, you have an employment visa, you got your FRR registration. Next thing is to get your tax registration, which is PAN number, like a permanent account number, which is a general tax number which we give to everybody who's working in India or earning income in India. And once you get that PAN number, then there are a few more registrations like bank account. So if you want to receive money in India, you want to pay expenses, you need a bank account. In order to have a bank account, you need your PAN number, like a tax number. Similarly, Social Security fund. In India, it's called Provident Fund. So if your employer in India is having more than 20 employees, then you would automatically fall under the Provident Fund regime. Whether you are employed by the Indian entity or you're employed by the foreign parent entity, if the Indian subsidiary is having more than 20 employees, you will automatically fall into the Provident Fund regulation. So you need to watch out. Next most important thing, visas issues with the spouse, partner, dependents, family who coming with you. So you need to also have to think about that what kind of a visa they should come into India. Typically they can come on a dependent visa, but mind you, they are not allowed to work on those dependent visa. So if they want to work in India, so you have to think from day one that what exactly my partner, my spouse would be doing in India. And it's also a very particular definition because partners are not equivalent to spouse in India from a definition from regulation point of view. So you have to watch out that as well. Again, impact on the Indian taxes, that will also depends upon your compensation structure, that what is written in your employment agreement. Would you be allowed to have a car from the company, or would you be allowed to have a house from the company? How would you better structure it? Should you have the house directly as a lease in your personal name and then take a reimbursement expenses from your company? And it's a different tax structure altogether. If you take the house in your personal name, or if you take the house, a company take the house in the company's name and then give to the expat to live in that apartment, which is very typical. And these are the things which I would say you have to think about it before writing the employment agreement, before going for the employment visa. And these are the tax structuring things which you need to worry about. And of course, the most important, or the last I would say for expat, is the annual tax compliances. So you have to think about what kind of annual tax return you have to file. Is there any other thing which you need to think about and worry about in India in terms of your monthly, quarterly filing? So most important is your tax return, annual tax return, and you are personally responsible to file your tax return, which is easy. You just get a tax note as a credit note from the company because they have deducted taxes from it, and they will give those credit note to you, and you need to go and file your return, which is, again, you can hire a Indian chartered accountant, or you can go online and learn how to file it, which is not very difficult to file a tax return. So these were the few things which I thought I should cover from an expat point of view. Now quickly, considering the time, if I try to cover from an employer point of view. So parent company and the Indian company, they both have to understand the situation that how the expat would work in India and the relationship with the Indian or the parent company. For example, if the expat is employed by the Indian entity, right, rather than the foreign entity, then every payment which is being made to the expat should be run through the Indian entity. from a cost perspective. Even though it is paid into the bank account in UK, if expat coming from UK, even though it is paid by the parent company, but parent company has to pass on the cost to India. Otherwise, there are significant permanent establishment issues which you need to think about as an employer. You also need to think about as an employer the transfer pricing regulation, because if you are reimbursing a cost of a expat from parent entity to the Indian entity or vice versa, there is definitely bound to have transfer pricing between those two entities. And transfer pricing is a very simple concept. Whenever there is a transaction between two related enterprises, you have to make those transactions on an arm's length basis. You cannot just come up with a price and make that transaction. Again, Provident Fund, as I was trying to educate from an expat point of view, from a company point of view, when you are taking an expat into India, you have to think about what are the Indian regulations. So Indian Provident Fund regulation talks about that when an expat is coming to India, you have to pay, if you have, of course, if the Indian company have more than 20 employees, then the expat has to deposit 25% of his total basic salary as a contribution to Provident Fund, which he cannot withdraw before the retirement age, which is 58 years. So think of that either you're going to have your company in India till he turns of 58, or he has to have a bank account when he needs to withdraw the money. So it's kind of a cost. It's kind of a cost which the foreign company has to budget when they're coming into India. Then of course tax registration. So you as a company has to think about what are the tax registration which you need to take about for your expat. Then withholding tax compliances, when you are making a payment to your expat as a company, as an employer, whether from a parent company or from the Indian company, you have to withhold taxes as per the Indian tax regulation. And most important, sometimes I do get question from, recently I got a query from one of our expat moving into India that, look, I don't want to pay Indian taxes. And my parent company is saying that, look, we are happy to pay your taxes. But mind it, when a parent company or Indian company is bearing the taxes on behalf of an expat, then there is something called as a tax concept, tax on tax. So because the tax which is paid by the company will become perquisite, which become like a benefit in the hand of an expat. So there will be tax on the tax, right? So there will be double tax basically, but that's a law. That's you need to think about. So that's called grossing up your taxes. So from expat and employer point of view, I think these are the major issues which you need to think about it.
Okay, great. So we've got a couple of questions which I'll just put to you from our guests. So the first one was around working on a business visa. So the question was, I understand that I'm able to earn money on a business visa and work in India. Is that correct?
Answer is no. So you would not be allowed to work in India. You would not be allowed to receive any income, money in India if you are on a business visa. As simple as that.
And so the visa type that you would need to apply
it has to be employment visa. If you want to receive any work money in India, if you want to earn any money in India, if you want to work in India, it has to be employment visa.
Okay. And then one other question was around taxation. So when I'm on an employment visa in India, do I have to pay tax on my worldwide income?
Yes, it's a very tricky question. So there is some concept. I don't want to go technically more into taxation, but whenever there is if I say in a practical way, if you're living in India for more than 2 years, then there is something called ordinary resident. And once you cross that limit and for 2 years living in India, third year, for example, in the third year, you will become ordinary resident and all your global income will be taxed in India.
Okay, so some good considerations there. So obviously tax and immigration is a big topic. We're not going to try and cover it all now. I've just got Paul. I'm going to loop you in on one question on the topic of corruption that you briefly touched on. So the question is, how do you make a distinction between where an Indian way of doing things ends and corruption begins?
Oh, well, there's many ways to answer that question. First and foremost, I would point you straight towards the requirements under the Bribery and Corruption Acts that exist in the UK and the US. They are very explicit. And so if you're talking about things like facilitation payments, which may not change the result of a transaction, they just may make it go faster, and happen on time, they're very expressly covered as unacceptable, whereas they may be considered the way of doing business in India. So it's very important. There's a growing body of practice where it's very common to either plan in the additional amount of time that it takes to get business licenses, or to expedite transactions or allow the transactions to go through the bureaucratic process. And increasingly, government organizations and so on are cognizant of the fact that foreign companies simply will not allow such practices to be engaged in. So there is growing awareness. It is a challenge, and you will face pressures. But in terms of what is the ordinary Indian way of doing business, it's expressly considered illegal, even under Indian law, in fact, as well as any other foreign law which has jurisdiction on your company doing business in India.
Okay, great, Paul. So the questions are coming in thick and fast. I'm conscious we've got 3 minutes left for the hour. Another one for you, Paul. So question for Paul. Other than patience, what other tips does Paul have to get middle management to make decisions and take responsibility?
Okay, there is persistence and resilience is very important. But I think one of the keys to working here, as I may have touched on, I think when I was talking earlier, is use open questions excessively. Use validation and revalidation tools to ensure that everybody understands and agrees what the outcomes are, or at least if there is a difference, that you use that process to flush it out. And spending the time and trusting your team to communicate with you, from building a relationship with them, that trust will come, and you can genuinely empower your teams through that way. One thing to be considered of is that often middle management is not empowered to make decisions, or don't believe they're made to make decisions. When you're working with a customer, although the decision may be made by the promoter at the very top, and if you need a decision made, you will have to go to the top. You still need to build a relationship with the middle management before you get to the top. You can't circumvent the process. So again, it comes down to taking the time and the patience to build those relationships and go through that process.
Good advice, Paul. Yeah, great. So I'm going to take the final question. The question is that I'm due to move to Mumbai in a couple of months' time. Where would I stay until I get myself set up? So, I mean, the reality there is obviously there are hotels in Mumbai, as there are anywhere. If you're expecting that may take some time, you don't want to be in a hotel. Service departments exist. It's still a relatively new industry in India, but certainly we can point you in the direction of a couple of providers. So, in short, don't worry about it. It's all feasible. So what I'm going to do now, I think we've kind of covered those 3 topics. I can see a couple of other questions which I will come back on, and particularly I can see one from Michael, which I just need a bit more information on to be able to answer. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Paul in particular for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule. So thanks to you, Paul. Your comments are, I'm sure, well received, and thank you from us.
Very welcome.
And then to my colleague Kapil as well. And of course, thanks to all of you for dialing in this evening. I hope you found this a fruitful session, and please keep an eye on our website for upcoming webinars, which are being updated regularly. Okay, thank you and good evening.
Thank you.